Now, good morning, everybody. Now, Mr. Gale.
Thank you, my lord. The first witness to the inquiry is Jane Morrison.
Okay, good. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning, my lord.
Very kind of you to come. Thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure if you're aware, but I don't propose to put people on oath in this inquiry. Yes. So we'll just go straight into questioning from Mr. Gale. Can I say if that at any stage of your examination you become upset or anything, or you feel you need a break for any reason at all, just indicate to me, let me know, and we'll accommodate that with no difficulty whatsoever.
Will do. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Now, Mr. Gale.
Thank you very much, my lord. Before I ask Miss Morrison to refer to any of her statements, can I just give your lordship and everybody else who is watching and listening just a few indications about Miss Morrison's evidence. Miss Morrison is part of the COVID Bereaved Scotland group. She has provided the inquiry with 3 statements, which I intend to call her personal statement, her organisational statement, and then her statement regarding grief and bereavement during a pandemic. And my intention very much is to lead her through her evidence under reference to those statements in that order. The personal statement and her organisational statement will be largely, if I can use this term, read-throughs, that they are quite detailed, and we think that it would be appropriate that she be given the opportunity to say everything that is within those statements without much interruption, particularly from me. So that is my intention with that. The grief and bereavement statement is a statement that she has provided the inquiry with quite recently after she and I discussed certain academic research that had been carried out. And I asked Ms. Morrison if she would provide us with some information on that. And so there will be some more interruptions at that point, but I thought it useful to give the inquiry that introduction. I should also say that Ms. Morrison has given evidence to the UK inquiry, and for the reference, it is in the transcript of the UKI on the 18th of July of this year, between pages 25 and 34 of the transcript. So with that, Miss Morrison, your full name, please.
It's Jane Morrison.
Yes. Now, your date of birth is known to the inquiry, and for present purposes, I think it's sufficient to say that you're 65.
Correct.
And again, your address is known to the inquiry, and again, it's sufficient to say that you live in Perthshire.
Correct, yes.
And now, again, for present purposes, I don't intend to take you through your career. That is set out in your statements. And I think it probably suffices to say that you've had a distinguished and varied career, and you're now retired.
Correct.
Right. As I've mentioned, you've provided 3 statements to the inquiry, and as you're aware, you're the first witness to give evidence to this inquiry. And the purpose of you giving evidence, as with many other witnesses, will be so that we can hear your accounts of the impacts that you suffered during the inquiry and hear those accounts in some detail. So with that, I think I can, again, with a small introduction, say that what's brought you to this inquiry is the tragedy of the death of your wife, Jackie, in October 2020 from COVID in Ninewells Hospital. And I think you're all right with me, and indeed everyone else, referring to your wife as Jackie.
Correct.
Okay. Lord Brailsford has already said this, and I'll simply reiterate, because it may be that I'm asking you a question or something. If you do feel that you would like a break at any point in our proceedings, you only have to say.
Thank you.
And that will be, I'm sure, granted to you. So, could you go, please, Ms. Morrison, to your personal statement in relation to Jackie. And if you could go to paragraph 3 of what is in your personal statement, and I'd like you to begin reading from there, please.
Yes, to read it. I wish to give a statement to the inquiry about my wife. Her name is Jackie, and well, as I say, she's better known as Jackie. Her date of birth was the 26th of January 1971, so she was only 49 when she died on the 24th of October 2020. She was in Ninewells Hospital in Tayside Health Board, and the local authority being Perth and Kinross. And we'd been together for 20 years, and we had a lot of fun and a lot of laughter. And she was registered blind. She had only 2% vision, and her eyesight was gradually getting worse. And it was a genetic condition that she had, but she didn't let it stop her. She was well known in wild swimming circles, but also known as the blind swimmer. She climbed Sydney Harbour Bridge. She did a trek to Everest Base Camp with a group of other visually impaired people. She ran the London Marathon, did the Edinburgh Moonwalk, and she even went up in a microlight, although I do hasten to add, not as a pilot. She was an occupational therapist until she had to give up work when her eyesight got too bad for that. And she'd worked in quite a lot of different hospitals because she preferred to do locum work rather than just being in one place all the time. And it might sound strange for someone who is blind, but we had a love of books and a love of reading, and that's what got us in touch with each other. And when we started talking about different books, and obviously it was quite a challenge for Jackie to read, but she did it. And we later went on to audiobooks because they were a lot easier. She had several guide dogs over that time, and she was an ambassador for guide dogs at one stage, talking to local schools, and she appeared on TV for them. But unfortunately, none of her guide dogs liked to swim, so they would not go into the water with her, and they'd be dancing on the shore saying, "Where are you?" She stopped work as an occupational therapist because, as I said before, when her eyesight was getting too bad, and she did a course in massage and reflexology and alternative therapies. And she felt these were treatments she could do because she had poor vision. She also did a course in counselling and, funnily enough, specifically in bereavement counselling. But people found it easy to talk to her. Possibly that was because of her visual impairment, but it was probably because they got to pet her guide dog while they were talking.
I'll just stop you there.
Indeed.
You've to a certain extent alluded to it already. The bereavement counselling that she did a course in and that she was interested in, was that something, obviously prior to the events that took her, was that something you talked to her about?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And so do I take it from that that you had something of an interest in, or vicariously had something of an interest in that yourself?
Yes, she went into bereavement counselling after her father died very young. He was only 60 when he died. And she found it quite difficult to deal with that, given the circumstances. And she went for bereavement counselling herself and got a lot out of it. And she felt she wanted to give something back. And because she'd been through it herself, she felt it was something she could genuinely understand when people spoke to her about it. So she did the course.
And did that experience of discussing that with her assist you when you came to look at some of the research that you have been asked to look at and make informed comments on it?
Yes, it did.
Right, thank you very much. Could you continue at paragraph 9, please?
Yes, yes. And she did try to set up a business doing that. It went for a while, but with her eyesight, it was letting her down again because it was really getting quite bad. She also ran a pet shop for a while. Again, the eyesight let her down. Because in addition to having the visual impairment, she was in chronic pain all the time. Because the eye condition, it basically put hundreds of wee blisters over the surface of her eye, which was, as you can imagine, quite agonising. It was like loads of grains of sand in her eye. And she had about 20 operations at Nine Wells Hospital. They were fantastic with her. And eventually she had to have her right eye removed completely because she had no useful vision in it at all, not even light and dark. And it was the most painful of the two eyes, so it was agreed to remove that and give her a prosthetic eye. But we did also have some laughs with that because she used to keep her spare eyes in the fridge on top of her chocolate, saying she was just keeping an eye on her chocolate. We had that sort of relationship, lots of laughter, lots of fun, not taking life too seriously, but not being stupid about it either. I mean, there was one time when we were away, we had a small motorhome, we were going up the East Coast, and she stopped to pop into the shops, and I went and filled up with fuel. And when I got back, her new eye was pointing the wrong way. And
I assume that's in her socket, yes.
Yeah. Way over here, because she hadn't had it very long and she was a bit wary of it. And she did say, I wondered why all those people were looking at me. And it was the first time she'd had a problem, and we were neither of us quite sure what to do. There was a little bit of toing and froing and sort of, shall we try this and try that? But in the end, she poured herself a large glass of wine, and they give her a wee plunger that she put it on and managed to get the eye in the right position. But as I say, we took the attitude, you have to laugh at life, otherwise it's just miserable. And I didn't appreciate, or truly appreciate, how much she was liked and admired until she died, because between the cards, the emails, messages, Facebook comments, and so on, I had about 600 expressions of condolence, showing what she meant to people and how much she inspired them because she just got on with it.
And I presume that getting those messages in the period after her death would have been very important for you, because there was limited people that you could associate with.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. Yes, it meant a lot. And it was good to see that so many people saw in her what I saw in her as well. We had a house extension and we put in an Aga cooker because that was originally developed by a blind man, so you don't have to worry about controls, and she loved cooking, although we did have one or two interesting dishes sometimes. But she was great at baking. It didn't do much good for my waistline, but it was lovely stuff, and she was so brave. She wouldn't let her visual impairment stop her, she wouldn't let pain stop her, and she wouldn't let people know when she was in pain. And we're just in the process of organising with the farmer up the road to have a bit of land, and had applied for planning permission, but it was all done in respect of Jackie's lack of vision, because it was greenbelt land and you could only have a house if it was adapted for a disability. So it was going to be a smart house, so she could operate everything by voice and different textures to tell when you're moving from one area to the next and so on. And sadly, I had to withdraw that after she died because of the modifications being for her, so I couldn't proceed.
Now you go on now to talk about the events that led to Jackie going into hospital. And again, I'd like you to just provide us with that background, please.
Certainly, yes. It was actually on the 4th of October, and I'd taken the dogs out, and she was fine when I left the house. And I came back about an hour later, and I asked if she was all right because she looked like she had jaundice. And then I thought, well, maybe it's just the lights. And I sat there a bit longer looking at her. And then I said, let me have a look at your eyes. And one was indeed yellow, and the prosthetic one was white. So I said, you've definitely got jaundice. It was a Sunday. I phoned NHS 24 to find out what to do. And they were very good. The nurse said she would have to get the doctor to call us back. I think she said it's something like 2 hours, but they actually called back within half an hour. And we went through everything with the doctor, and she said she'd have to go to hospital because of it. And they arranged for a COVID test before she went in. We had to go to a different place in Dundee for that. And it was simply because she'd had a bit of a cough for a few weeks. We were pretty sure it wasn't COVID because she didn't have any other symptoms. And we went to King's Cross Hospital in Dundee. They did the COVID test. We even had a wee laugh about that because Jackie had quite a strong gag reflex. And she told me, you've never seen a doctor jump back so fast when he did the throat swab and she started gagging. And the test came back negative, so we know she definitely did not have COVID at that stage. When we went to Ninewells after that and the nurse came down, she met us at the door and explained that I couldn't go in and everything else, and she was taking Jackie up to the ward, which she did. I can't remember if she was put in a side room or not until they got the result through, because at that time it was taking several hours to get results off the tests. But that's a general problem with the pandemic. Everything was taking longer. I mean, if you went for an MRI scan, what normally they could do quite a few people in a couple of days, too much longer, because after everybody had been in, they had to thoroughly disinfect the scanner, then leave it for 20 minutes at least before anyone could go in.
And I think just to get the time frame of this, maybe that it needs to just be emphasised. Obviously, the beginning of the pandemic was March.
Correct.
February, March of 2020, and Jackie went into hospital in October, so it's 6-7 months later.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right, please go on.
Yeah. So obviously I had to leave her. The nurse took her in. I went home. There was clearly a problem with the liver. They didn't know what it was because unless she was having to reposition her eye, she was not a drinker. So it wasn't anything like that. They checked it wasn't cancer, and we did find out afterwards that a couple of relatives had the same eye condition, which was a mutation of the eye disease, and there's only 3 other families in the UK that are known to have that. So, as I say, some of our older relatives had liver problems and died of it, but we only found this out literally when she was in hospital doing the tests. And the consultant thought because her eye condition was destroying the epithelium of her eye, and it was possibly destroying the epithelium of her internal organs. And if I may bring in a bit, I didn't have in my statement there that about COVID, everybody just refers to it as a respiratory virus. And it's actually a respiratory and vascular virus. And the vascular element of it, when it's the endothelium, it destroys in all the blood vessels, and that's what causes all the blood to get sticky and clot and so on, and does the organ damage in people. So about 2 years before, she'd had symptoms of diabetes, and she became insulin dependent, but there were minuscule doses of insulin that she needed. They couldn't quite understand why, and seemingly there's 6 types of diabetes, but she didn't tick all the boxes on any of them. So there was something weird going on. With hindsight, we think it was possibly the eye condition attacking the pancreas, and it was intermittent because sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Again, it didn't stop her. She just did whatever she had to do and got on with it. But they were doing lots of tests and biopsies and things like that while she was in Nine Wells. And when she's in 12 days, that's when they did the main biopsy.
I know you, excuse me, I know you're going to come to this, but in those 12 days that she was in Nine Wells, what sort of contact were you able to have with her?
Visiting was allowed. It was by appointment only, so they didn't have everybody turning up at the same time. And you had to wear masks and pinny, and I'm pretty sure gloves as well. In theory, I could have gone up every day, but it was over an hour's drive each way. So Jackie said, just come up every second day. But there was only once I was turned back when they had possibly someone who possibly positive for COVID, so no visitors were allowed in.
Okay.
That.
Right, thank you. Please continue.
Yeah. That's all right, we can go back up because just lost place. Yes, sorry. They were monitoring her bilirubin levels very carefully, and they seem to get concerned if they go over 30. And in the time that Jackie was in hospital, they went from 230 to 650. They just couldn't get them under control. So there was something serious going on. The medical staff said if she hadn't got COVID and lived, she may very well have needed a transplant. And they drained fluid from her abdomen, again, which happens when the liver's not working properly. I did ask the doctor how serious it was, and he said, again, we may get to the stage of needing a transplant, but we're not there yet. They were thinking of, should it be talking a year, 2 years in the future?
Yes.
And they said there were still things they could do. And she was moved around the hospital a few times simply because of bed space. And we had a joke when we were going into the hospital first time, because she'd been in hospital so often with all her operations over the 20 years. I said to her, oh, the only part of the hospital you've not been in is maternity unit. However, because of the bed shortage, she was moved there for a few days at one stage, so she got the full hat trick.
She had that experience.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, as I said, you had to make an appointment to visit her. In fact, there was a couple of times I couldn't go in because they might have had a COVID patient. No visitors allowed until that was sorted. And yes, I had to wear the PPE.
Was that provided to you, or
yes.
did you bring your own, as it were?
Yeah, I actually took my own mask because it was a higher quality mask than the surgical mask.
Okay.
But yes, it was all there and provided. And usually stayed a maximum of an hour. If Jackie was looking tired, then I'd just go. The one thing was, throughout all this time, patients didn't have to wear masks. And she'd been in hospital 10 days, I think, and I was waiting one time for her to come back from tests. And a woman's husband turned up with the kids, and the ward sister came out and quite rightly said no children were allowed in. It was only one adult visitor, so they'd have to go outside. And immediately the wife followed them outside, kind of defeating the whole purpose of it. I watched her come back in. She didn't even use the alcohol gel. And it expands on one thing I've mentioned to people before. Every time I went to visit, there were patients in the car parks with no masks, no social distancing, getting round the one visitor rule by meeting friends and families out there and then walking back into the hospital.
Okay.
We do have one woman in our group who's a nurse, and when the pandemic started, she was put the front door of the hospital she worked at. And she said she was trying to stop people going out and doing that, and she was just getting verbal abuse and threats and everything else. So it's a mentality that we have to figure out how to deal with for the future.
Yes, okay.
I say I had to wear the PPE, and Jackie didn't have to wear any. I did raise this with the hospital when I was talking to the consultants about it, when I was waiting for them to take Jackie off all the machines so they could take her into a side room and I could be with her when she died. There were faults in the hospital, but I also mentioned to them about the patients going outside. And I made a couple of observations. If you're moving the patient around the hospital, why aren't they wearing masks? And in addition, some wards had different levels of PPE for the visitors. The maternity unit, for example, had lower levels of PPE. Because when I went in, I asked, where's the mask PPE? And they said, oh, just wear the mask you've got and don't worry about anything else. So the doctor I was speaking to, the consultant, she listened to me and she said it was very useful because she was in infection control, and she said they were having an inquiry into the hospital, into why they had a COVID outbreak in the hospital, and that the information I had given her was very useful.
Yes.
I did get given the name of a consultant, I think it was sort of the head of the department, who I could contact, not just for that, but if I had any questions about anything or wanted more information about Jackie's infection and death. She was very good. I did raise all the points about the masks and other things, and she did contact me. I think it would have been about January 2021 when she contacted me and said they'd concluded their investigation and asked if I'd like to come up and speak to them and go through it all with them. I said no at the time because I just wasn't up to doing it, but I know they produced a report because when they had their unannounced hospital inspection visit in February 2021, it was mentioned.
I think just, if I can pause you there, one of the things that you mentioned subsequently in your personal statement and then in your organisational statement and indeed in your final statement is the importance of communication.
Absolutely.
And I think what you're saying there and have said there is that your experience, particularly during Jackie's illness, was that the communication that you received was very good.
It was for me, yes. I was very lucky compared with many in the group where the communication was dreadful.
Yes. And I think that's one of the benefits, I suppose, of you being involved in the care, the COVID Bereaved group, is that you have the perspectives of others who you can juxtapose to the experience that you had. Absolutely. And was not the same experience.
Yes, yes. I mean, as I mentioned later on, I take the view if one hospital can get it right in my situation, then surely all of them can get it right.
Yes. Okay. Can you continue on? I think you're at, paragraph 42.
Yes, I was just going to say that in the report done of the inspection visit, it's actually paragraph 53 of that report that refers to the investigation done by Nine Wells Hospital.
Okay. Just well, thank you for that reference. We'll look at that. Thank you.
They were monitoring Jackie very carefully, and it was about 3 a.m. on the 15th day, because they were taking obs every 2 hours, that they noticed a spike in temperature. And they thought it might have been an infection starting from either the biopsy or the drains. So they immediately put her on antibiotics. As the morning progressed, they saw it didn't make any difference at all, and the temperature was still going up. So they did a whole raft of tests, including a COVID test, which they were unable to do because she had a temperature. If she hadn't had a temperature, they couldn't have done the COVID test at that time. Because you could only have a COVID test if you had one of the 3 cardinal symptoms, which was cough, fever, or loss of taste and smell. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, actually, before you told me that she'd been in hospital 15 days by that time.
Yes.
Had a battery of tests by the look of about other things, but they hadn't given her a COVID test, but that's the explanation.
That's the explanation why, yes.
All right, thank you. Sorry, Mr. Gill.
Not at all, Madam. Thank you.
But yes, as the morning progressed, they saw it wasn't making any difference, so they did all the tests. It came back positive. They honestly weren't expecting it to come back positive, but it did. And then she has moved straight into the COVID ward. They'd quite a good setup in Ninewells. They'd made a hospital within the hospital. So they'd taken over one area where they'd made a COVID ward, COVID high dependency unit and COVID intensive care, all in the one area. What was lucky was it was just at the start of the second wave, which it probably did mean they had more time to give to me than they might have done previously in the first wave or in the chaos of the second wave. And as I mentioned before, the communication was very good. They phoned me regularly and they said I could phone at any time to check on Jackie's condition. And when she'd been in the ordinary ward, the ordinary COVID ward, and was just on supportive oxygen, she had been able to FaceTime me and that sort of thing. So on the Wednesday evening, she was moved to the high dependency unit because her oxygen levels were going down, and she was put on the CPAP, the continuous positive airway pressure. Once that's on, we can't really talk. We did try a couple of phone calls, but all I could hear was the air.
The noise of the machine.
Yeah, yeah. But they did keep me very well informed, and they told me everything that we're doing as they were doing it. For example, when they put in an artery monitor for getting the most detailed right blood oxygen levels, they told me when they did that, and the other machines that were involved. And at that stage, they were still planning that if they had to take her into intensive care, they could do so. However, when her kidneys failed and then her liver failed, and in addition to the maximum CPAP oxygen, they couldn't get her oxygen levels above 60%. And they had a meeting with the consultants of the high dependency unit, the consultant of intensive care, the renal consultant, and the liver consultant. And that was decided. There was nothing they could do because of the organ failure, and especially with the liver, because once that was gone, they couldn't do anything about that other than a transplant, and obviously they wouldn't give a COVID patient a transplant. Jackie was fully aware of everything that was going on.
Was that important for her?
It is.
Yeah. Was it important for her? Was it important for you?
It was, but not necessarily in the way everybody expects, because by that stage she knew she was dying. And I couldn't be with her when she was told she was dying. And, you know, to be sort of there on your own, thinking about it, and the realisation that that's going on, it provides its own trauma. But Jackie actually decided that as there was nothing more they could do, she said, "I'm ready, take me off all the machines." And they asked her that if she could hang on, they'd try and do it so that I could get there, on which she said she would do. But could we move up, and thank you. Sorry, I've dotted, I just dotted about a wee bit.
No.
Yes, I mean...
I think you go on to tell us that not having a drink that night was probably a benefit for you.
Yeah, oh, definitely, yes. I mean, what it was, I thought I wasn't going to be there with her when she died. And the hospital at that stage had indicated I couldn't be with her when she died. And so I was talking to some friends on the phone, and I thought, you know, what do you do sitting there? And I actually poured myself a large drink, and I think my guardian angel smacked me up the back of the head, and thank goodness I didn't touch it at all, because the hospital rang half an hour later and said, look, we've managed to find the side room, the COVID ward. You can go in there and you can be with her at the end, which was wonderful to be able to do that. Jackie said she told them she had enough, so they took her off everything. I had over an hour's drive to get there, and once I got there, the consultant came out to meet me and was sitting talking with me while they got Jackie sorted out, because I don't know, somewhere in there I said, for example, they tried dialysis, but her blood was so sticky it jammed the dialysis machine and so on. But they got her all ready, took her into the side room, and I was able to sit with her for 15 minutes before she died. And then I sat with her for a while afterwards. And the two young male nurses on the ward were lovely. They asked if I was going to be all right going home on my own. And they gave me the direct number of the ward, so if I needed to talk to anybody, I could phone them up any time during the night, because they were on night shift, obviously, and they'd talk to me, and I thought that was very kind of them. The consultant as well had gone through everything with me, told me what would happen, and also explained about the documentation, that when they do the death certificate, and not to worry about that, they would email it direct to the registrar, and the registrar would get in contact with me and sort everything out. The registrar as well, she was lovely. When she phoned, she said, look, I've gone through your civil partnership and your marriage certificates. I've got most of the information I need, just need to confirm a couple of points. So I didn't have to go through all of Jackie's details and family details.
I suppose in any circumstance that's important, but particularly in the circumstances
yes.
you faced,
yes.
that was particularly important.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
COVID was given as the cause of death. In fact, it was, quote, pandemic COVID-19, that was the cause of death. The other conditions might have contributed, but they wouldn't have caused her death at that time. And it was very peaceful. But she'd gone in 4th of October, died on the 24th. So, I mean, as I say, I've made the point about infection control, but with the treatment she got, I don't have any complaints about that at all. They did everything they could, and every time I phoned up, I got answers, or if the person was busy, they would ask if they could get a colleague to phone back, because the other person was dealing with Jackie, and that was fine. The communication I got on the final day was superb, especially when I do hear what other people had to go through. I say Jackie was fully aware of what's going on, and the consultant actually commented it's one of the horrible things about COVID for someone in Jackie's position, because they are fully compos mentis and knew exactly what's happening throughout. Because obviously they couldn't be sedated, because that would suppress the breathing. And as I mentioned earlier, my lord, the only testing that was done at that time was if you had one or more of the three cardinal symptoms. That was the only reason she got the COVID test, otherwise she wouldn't have had it.
Now you go on in the next section of your statement to talk about infection control, and some of these points I think you hinted at already. The incidence of people coming out of the hospital, meeting their families out of the hospital without PPE, and then being able to go back into the hospital. Just take us through your thoughts on that, please, at paragraph 58 and following.
Yes. I mean, within the hospital, the cleanliness and the PPE available for visitors, I actually thought it was pretty good from what I did see. I mean, if I want to nitpick, there were a couple of things, like when I went in with some fresh clothes, and they said, oh, we tried to contact you to tell you not to visit today because possibly COVID. They didn't know whether I could leave the clean clothes or not. in a bag. In the end, they did take them in, which I think was the right thing to do, so Jackie could be comfortable. In maternity unit, there was an elderly lady who was in, and her daughter brought her lady's husband with her, but he had Alzheimer's, so he wouldn't be able to remember what was said, and the daughter was allowed to go in with him as well. At the time, I thought maybe it was a breach of infection control, but I felt it was a compassionate, right thing to do. And I actually subsequently found out that, I think it was July 2020, they brought in a rule where people could go in with someone who had Alzheimer's or special needs in those circumstances.
I think one of the points that we are going to hear a good deal of is the possible conflict between strict infection control and what might otherwise be seen as compassionate access to people, whether they're in hospital or in care homes. So I think that what you're saying there is perhaps an example of what could be done, perhaps shouldn't have been done, but was done.
Yes, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to get right, and I do appreciate that it was all new territory with the pandemic. I do also believe quite a lot of it was put down to problems with PPE. If there'd been an abundant supply of PPE, I suspect more people might have been allowed in more circumstances to visit, particularly in care homes.
Okay. I think you can probably just go on to the section on funeral now, if you like,
yes.
Ms. Morrison.
I say, not wanting to be the same as everybody else, Jackie had already decided that she wanted to be cremated, but she didn't want a funeral because she didn't want that to be the last thing that people remembered about her. This was decided way before COVID and that, and she just wanted to be taken off on her own for the cremation. So that's what I arranged. As it was, it worked out well because I was still in quarantine at that time, because obviously she was still infectious at the end. And her family didn't live in Scotland, and I spoke to them on the phone and told everybody what was happening and what time to think about her. It made it much easier for me, I must admit, being selfish, because how the heck do you choose who the other 5 are going to be to go to a funeral? It would have been so difficult to have to do that. So that's what we did.
You then go on to tell us about DNRs.
Yes.
And I think this was something that was applicable. So could you just tell us your thoughts on that, please?
Yes. Just talking about my situation, as you know, when we talk about within the group, I've got a lot more to say on it there. But it's mainly on the final day, because they hadn't asked me about DNRs before that, but the consultant and I had the discussion about DNRs. As I say, they thought she was going to be all right before that. But because, well, once her liver went, as you know, we couldn't do anything. As I said before, they couldn't do dialysis because her blood was too sticky with the COVID. And the consultant, she was also speaking to Jackie at the same time. It was a 3-way conversation going on. And she asked what our views on CPR were, and was that something Jackie and I had spoken about before? And we had, again, thank goodness, we decided that if nature decided the time was right, then that was it, and not to do CPR. I think a lot of that was also down to the constant pain that Jackie was in with her eye condition, and she also knew that she was going to be totally blind in the future, which she was dreading. Also with her occupational therapist background, she knew all about it and what it entailed, and she said she didn't want it, which I agreed with, but I said if she had changed her mind and wants to do it, I would support her in whatever she wanted to do. And the consultant confirmed that that's what Jackie had said to her she wanted, and I think she just wanted to make sure we were both saying the same thing But she did add that Jackie still had her sense of humour, because when she asked her about it, Jackie did add, "Mind you, I hoped I'd been in my 80s before you asked me that." So, comic to the end.
You do mention the consultant in paragraph 69, 70, and in paragraph 70, you do name the consultant. Can I ask you not to?
Yes.
In the in your evidence, because that would be subject to our order.
Yeah. But yes, I mean, I've got to acknowledge in some ways it might be a little bit different for me compared with some people, because I do come from a medical family and I knew what the consultant was talking about. So she didn't have to go down to the real basics of explaining to me what CPR meant and what it entailed, and I didn't know what she's talking about. And yes, the DNR was put in place. But I also like to acknowledge in particular the level of communication between myself and the consultant on that final day. She was excellent and answered all my questions, and she came out, even came out the high dependency unit to talk to me. We were waiting to take Jackie off all the machines and explain what would happen next.
Now, with all that background, Ms. Morrison, you're in this personal statement, and I know you go on in your organisational statement to do the same thing, but you're going to tell us what you see as some of the lessons to be learned, and also your hopes for the inquiry. And I'd like you just to read through those parts of your statement, please.
Yes. From my perspective, the main lesson to be learned is on infection control. I mean, what's the point of having all these rules that what's got to be done in a hospital and all the medical staff have to do if patients are just going to walk outside, break all the rules and come back in, potentially bringing COVID in with them? It's just, it totally defeats the object of infection control in my view. And the next lesson is if we're moving patients around the hospital, they must wear PPE, and they must be protected by wearing PPE. And if you are moving someone around the hospital, you must have the same level of protection on all wards on that. The other massive issue is we must be in a position to do a significant number of tests as quickly as possible and give consideration for increased testing, irrespective of symptoms or lack of symptoms in healthcare environments. And the other one, which is a biggie for me, is communication. If you can talk about someone's death being a positive experience, in that context, for myself, it was a positive experience. But as I say, there's so many who haven't had that and don't have good communication. So if one person can do it, they can all do it.
Hopes for the inquiry?
Yes, that we can get infection control right. As I said, my personal hobby horse is communication, because I got excellent communication. But I've listened to so many stories from people in our group who've had such a dreadful time. And this is why I think something like nicely done leaflets, not childish leaflets, just explaining each thing. What does CPR involve, and why are we saying we're not going to do it? That sort of thing. I mean, I would suggest it needs some palliative care specialists and doctors and nurses to get together and say, what are the main questions we're asked, and how can we translate that into something that can be handed out to people generally to help them understand what's going on. Because you also don't take in everything when you're stressed and in that situation. But the biggest thing of all, though, is we must have proper plans and procedures in place across the board, so that when the next pandemic hits, as everyone knows, it will do, and from the outset we want people to know what needs to be done.
Right, thank you, Ms. Morrison. You've signed your statement and dated it, and you confirm that that is your statement for the purposes of the inquiry.
Correct.
I wonder if we could take a few minutes.
Of course we can. Yeah. How long do you want, Mr. Gill?
Just 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yes.
Do you want to actually take the Let's call it the coffee break, although that's probably the wrong term. Do you want to take that now?
We can do, yes.
Yeah, that's the sensible thing. So it's now, what is the time? It's as it happens, it's 10:02. So why don't we just come back at 10 past?
Okay. Thank you, my lord.
Very good. Thank you very much. Right, now, good morning again, Ms Morrison. Mr Gale, when you're ready.
Thank you, my lord. Ms Morrison, can we have a look at your witness statement, which is I've described as your organisational statement. It's a longer statement.
Yes.
There's a lot of material in it that, to a certain extent, you've already touched upon when you've spoken about your own personal perspective. So there will be sections that I will perhaps skim over a little bit.
Yes.
So I should say that everything that's within your statement will be considered by the, every word of it will be considered by the inquiry. So if, simply because it hasn't been read out, it's not disregarded. Again, you set out your background, and at paragraph 3, you explain that you're part of the Scottish COVID Bereaved group, and in paragraph 4, you said that you had a meeting with the former First Minister in March 2021, as it had become clear that you and others of like mind needed to be an autonomous group to deal with Scottish issues. And you originally started off as a Scottish branch of the wider group of COVID Families for Justice.
Correct.
And there were some differences of opinion, which, for present purposes, I don't think we need to go through. But paragraph 6, you say that everybody in the group had been bereaved, and you refer to that as being a sort of qualification for membership of the group, I suppose, put it bluntly. And you then say, and I hope you don't mind, but I took that next quote, I did attribute it to you, so I didn't pass it off as my own, but I did take that quote in the opening statement that I made, and I think it's probably better that it comes from you. So if you could just read paragraph 6 and just explain the background to that, please.
Yes. So everybody in the group has been bereaved, and yes, we do, for want of a better expression, use the word it's a qualification for joining the group. And originally it was just that people wanted someone else who understood what they were feeling, because I think we've all found out that bereaving during a pandemic is a very different thing from want of a better expression, normal bereavement.
Yeah. Now, I think also you go on to indicate that your membership of the group had diverse backgrounds, and that eventually you had a meeting with the former First Minister, as we've mentioned, in March 2021, and that was, I think, in part, at least, because you wanted a Scottish public inquiry.
Correct.
And I understand, and obviously we understand, that there was a positive response to that.
Yes.
And I think you say in paragraph 10 that as a group we have managed, I hope, to take a positive approach to all of this. You want answers, but you also want to be constructive in getting those answers. Yes. And I think you particularly are aware that there are certain matters that this inquiry can't give you answers about, regrettably.
Yes.
I'm sure for many people. But there are matters, obviously, that we will endeavour to provide context and information for you. You also say at paragraph 10 that you have experiences of both good and bad practices.
Correct.
And I think these are matters that you want to share with the inquiry. And you then go on to talk to us about the type of services that, the service that Scottish COVID Bereaved provides and continues to provide. And I think it began in part, at least with a Facebook page, but I think it's also, you also recognize that some people, looking at myself, are not particularly adept at social media, and therefore you had provision for other people to join and who didn't have that approach. Mm-hmm. And I think you've also indicated in that section of the difference between care home deaths and what is called nosocomial death.
Correct.
And perhaps just for the benefit of everybody, can you explain what that is?
Yes, obviously the care home deaths, which accounts for about 9% of the deaths in our group, which actually matches the national statistics as well. The nosocomial deaths, which is hospital-acquired infection, and I just checked the latest figures as well, and it's 25% of our members have lost someone to nosocomial COVID. So that's 3 times the death rate than it is for care homes in nosocomial. Mm-hmm. Do you want me to explain the definitions of that?
Well, just, I think it's probably useful if you explain what it is.
Yeah, when someone goes into hospital, if they have COVID in day 1 or day 2, it's deemed they caught it in the community before they went into hospital. If it's day 3 to day 7, it's indeterminate where they caught it. If it's day 8 to day 14, it's probably caught in hospital, and day 15 onwards, it's definitely been caught in the hospital.
Thank you. And you do go on to talk in this section of your statement about the interaction with other members of your group, and at the bottom of paragraph 14, you give, I think, probably an anecdotal and general quote when you say, "Oh, that's what happened to me," and that was something that brought you and other members of your group together.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And then I think you give a slightly more difficult aspect of what was said in paragraph 15, and perhaps you could just read that, please.
Yes, it's talking about the monthly Zoom meetings we do for any members who want to come along. They can just share their stories, and nobody's mocking them, because when you actually say in public, "I lost someone to COVID," you're immediately getting the response from people, "Oh, there must have been something else wrong with them," or "they were very old." It's all those sorts of stupid things. So a lot of people actually don't say in public how they lost someone. And obviously within the group, we understand what it's like, and we don't have any of that stupidity. So people can talk from a place of, I wouldn't say comfort, but a place of knowing that the rest of the people genuinely understand.
Yeah. Okay. Can I now just take you on, and again remind you that we have all that you've said there. Can I take you on to the section on people represented by Scottish COVID Bereaved? And I think what you say there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a wide and diverse backgrounds.
Very much so, yes. Because obviously we just got together because someone had been bereaved, but as the group grew and the membership grew and spoke to more people and you find out what they do, we have people from all walks of life and all sorts of jobs and professions. You know, we've got medical people, nursing people, teachers, retired, scientists, cleaners, everything. We've got it. And it doesn't matter what the background is, they're all there because we've lost someone to COVID.
Yes. Paragraph 25, you mentioned the interaction of the group with the Inquiries Listening Project, Let's Be Heard, and I think what you're indicating there is that that's been quite positive.
Yes, when the Let's Be Heard was being developed, we had some volunteers who worked with the team to give some thoughts and input and views. And then once that was sorted out and how it's going to be, we were giving people ideas on how to get prepared for doing it online. And we did a few posts and talking to people about it. So it was really getting the message home. This is a good platform to tell your story.
And I think on behalf of the inquiry and in particular on behalf of Let's Be Heard, we're very grateful for that. Just going to paragraph 26, you say that the Facebook page is the group's main focal point. And just to get an idea of the size of the group, towards the end of that paragraph, you say that we represent families of over 200 bereaved individuals who are signed up on the legal side.
Yes.
Just explain what that is. What's being signed up on the legal side is?
We do have members who just want to be members of the group and they didn't want to get involved in the legal side and inquiry side. They would find it too traumatic. They just wanted to try and cope, but no, they had people they could talk to. So we never force anyone to sign up. If they're not comfortable with it, they get the choice. They can sign up with Amwer's team to be represented in the inquiries.
You touch on the geographical area covered, and I think you indicate that this is across Scotland, and much of your communication is done remotely by Zoom.
Correct.
And other platforms, I suppose. You then go on to talk about the roles within Scottish COVID bereaved. And I think that there were effectively, I don't know whether I'd call it a committee, but there were 5 of you who spoke to the former First Minister.
Yes. Yes.
And how did that group come about?
We put our hands up at the wrong time. No, it came about really because when we knew we'd have a meeting with the First Minister, Alan Whiteman, who was pulling it all together, he asked if there was anybody who particularly wanted to speak to the First Minister. And we all said yes. And it just sort of from there, the wee group we started we called it the First Minister's Speaker Group. And then we came what would be called the lead group. And we set our aim was to get the inquiry and to get legal representation for the group. And we formally disbanded as a lead team a few weeks ago. That's because we met our commitments, but also to fit in with the UK inquiry. Because of the modular approach taken, it seemed silly to have people who were involved just because they were on the lead team for that specific topic, but they didn't have personal experience of it. So what we will actually do for each topic is have a wee group who will be the lead group for that topic. That's how it's going to work.
Okay. Can I take you on in your statement to paragraph 45? So taking a bit of a leap. You there look at the approaches taken by this inquiry and the UK inquiry, and we know what you say, and we're well aware of what you say in paragraph 49 in particular. Yep. And we take that on board. In paragraph 50, you say that we are taking in this inquiry something that is quite different, an approach to what is being taken in the UKI. Obviously, you've heard my opening statement, and you've heard me say this before, that this was a considered decision, and we have a particular view on that. I suppose from your point of view, and indeed from many people's point of view, I can put it this way, the jury is out on whether or not this is the correct approach?
Yes, I find it a very interesting approach, and I think it works well. Whether the difference is because we're a smaller country, so we're not going to have hundreds of thousands of people speaking at the inquiry, that you can do it like that. I mean, the UK one, it would be a far bigger task to do that. But no, I totally understand the logic of it. The other thing is that for those who are called to speak at the inquiry, and no disrespect to the inquiry, but you've got it out the way at the beginning, and to a certain extent don't have to keep reliving the experience. So from that point of view, I think it's very positive.
Thank you. Right. From paragraph 51 onwards, and it's a lengthy section in your statement, and that's not a criticism. But what you do is you set out various matters that you want this inquiry to take notice of. And some of these you've already talked about. DNA CPR, you've talked about. Communication, you've talked about. Infection control, you've talked about. But now you're giving it more from the perspective of the group rather than from your own personal perspective, albeit that is informed by your own personal perspective. And I think probably paragraph 51 is important, albeit it is in general terms. It's important for this to be said, and I would like you to say it, please. What's in paragraph 51? Yes,
as a group, we're saying, please listen to us, because we have so much information, and we really don't want anyone to ever go through what we went through. As I said before, we've got examples of good practice as well as bad practice, and if some places can get it right, everybody can get it right.
Would you go on to 52, please?
Yes. What we're finding is we have different health boards who are acting slightly differently, or the ethos within the health board is different. Sadly, if someone comes to me and says they've had such and such a problem, in my mind, I'm thinking particular hospitals, particular health boards, and very often it is the case when they eventually name the hospital. So we're already seeing clear trends of areas that don't do it as well as other areas, shall we say. And sometimes you're getting differences between hospitals within one health board, and even between wards in one hospital. There's a lack of consistency across the board.
Thank you. Again, you go on to talk about CPR, and I think really you've made that point of the need for that to be properly communicated so that it can be properly understood by the recipient.
Yes.
And again, you go on to talk about communication in general terms, I think.
Yes.
You again praise your Jackie's consultant for her level of communication, and I suppose also one of the things that comes across from your particular experience is that do not resuscitate and CPR was something that you and Jackie had talked about.
Yes.
Yeah, could you go to paragraph 63, please? You've said there that you think that the organisation will be asking more questions than giving answers. And if the purpose of the organisation with regards to the inquiry is to point in the direction the inquiry should be speaking to get information that the inquiry is looking for. Can you just then go on to read perhaps the next few paragraphs so we can have the context of that introductory remark?
Yes, it's both actually, because as a group, as I've mentioned before, we want answers and we want to know why things went wrong, why wasn't there appropriate plans in place. But we have a load of issues we want to raise with the inquiry, and we want answers. But as I've said before, we want to help by sharing our experiences and our knowledge. Obviously, a lot of it's going to be political because that's the structure of the nation. But we hope that the politicians, scientists, chief medical officers and so on are big enough to put politics aside and just tell it like it was. You know, what issues did they have, and how can we make it easier in the future? Or how can they make it easier in the future to make decisions and that sort of thing? We're asking for a full and frank discussion, if you will, on it.
And I think you're directing that particularly at decision makers and possibly also implementers, and putting it in a particular term, you're looking for candour.
Yes, yes. Okay. I think as well, I may say that we're hoping within the Scottish inquiry that it will go down to the level of individual health boards, possibly in some instances individual hospitals as more information becomes available. And, you know, perhaps ask social services a question: were you aware of any issues in a care home during that time? And if so, what did you do? Rather than just talk about care homes generally.
Right. Could you go to paragraph 72, please? And you're talking there, I think, immediately prior to that, you've drawn the distinction between a nursing home and a care home.
Correct,
which
yes.
sometimes gets blurred.
Yes.
Or possibly not understood. So that's quite important to make that distinction. And you then refer to the guidance given by the British Geriatric Society in March 2020. Mm-hmm. And for your information, we will be hearing from a representative of the British Geriatric Society in a much wider response. But you have a particular issue that you want to raise under reference to that information. Yes,
just emphasising the point, because a nursing home will have a qualified nurse in it, and a care home is personal care, helping them get up, get dressed, feeding people, that sort of thing. So basically, you're suddenly asking care home staff who have no experience whatsoever, things like what is the correct way to take a temperature. And while they may have taken temperatures before and they might have done readings, would they know what to do with them? What had they recorded? Did they understand what different readings meant in the context of COVID? Because they didn't have that knowledge and experience to do that. And to some extent, you feel sorry for them because they were chucked in at the firing line with no preparation for dealing with that.
Yeah. Paragraph 73, you talk about PPE. Mm-hmm. Interested just to have your comments in 73 and 74 on that, please.
Yes, with PPE, in the UK sent a lot of PPE to China at the start of the pandemic. I think it was actually in February 2020. And there's other things. The Army used to be the custodian of the UK PPE stockpiles. In fact, for all the stockpiles, they had the Green Goddess fire engines and so on. And they looked after all that. They had very good systems in place, and they would careful to rotate stock. So if something was getting towards the end of its life, it'd be sent out to the hospitals, so it was used in time, and you didn't end up with out-of-date stock on the shelves. I think with the privatisation of PPE has been, I didn't actually use the word in my statement, but I think it was a disaster. There's evidence of at least one privatised company who put a lot of PPE in a leaky warehouse which had asbestos problems and everything else, and it was just sitting there in the warehouse, not even on shelves. There was another one that's just fairly recently been exposed where somewhere in the New Forest they found tons of PPE dumped in the open on that.
Okay. Paragraph 76 is, as you put it, your bugbear. I think you call it your biggie in your other statement, and that's testing. Can you just go through that section, if you would, please?
Yes, as I mentioned before, originally tests were only available if you had, at that stage, it was 2 symptoms. It was temperature and cough. And then, following information from the Zoe Health study, which identified the lack of taste and smell, it went up to only those 3 symptoms. Yet the same paper referred to earlier on from the British Geriatric Society, and in plenty of other papers, but just referencing the BGS one, which was right at the beginning of the pandemic, it was already recognised that elderly people would not have those symptoms. They would have completely different symptoms. And I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but I think it's something very low. It's either less than 10% or less than 20% would even present with a fever, and they wouldn't have cough. So they'd have completely different symptoms, but they weren't eligible for tests because they were not those 3 symptoms.
Just an observation, if I may. You referenced the BGS paper, and that was obviously very early in the pandemic. Am I right in thinking that you have educated yourself very much in what was the pandemic and its circumstances, and a lot of very detailed information? Yes,
it was one of the ways that I coped. I wanted to know everything and anything all about it, so I have well over 1,000 documents I'd acquired. I also did a timeline for the first year for UK government, Scottish government and other items, which comes to nearly 100 pages of detail. So yes, I did a lot of research into it.
Thank you. If you just go down to paragraph 79, please. And perhaps you just read that out, because I think we're talking there about testing.
Yes. The government, the UK government, they made quite a big thing of they were the first ones to develop a COVID test, which, yes, they did, but they didn't go on and take the opportunity of having it mass manufactured. They were offered a chance to go in with Roche in Germany to do a joint manufacturing thing, and it was turned down by the UK government because their stance was, we've left Europe, we can manage on our own. And Germany were producing, by the end of February it says there 2021, but that's actually an error. It should be February 2020.
Yes.
They were producing 4 million tests. I can't remember off the top of my head whether it was either a week or a month, but they were producing millions of tests, and we weren't.
Paragraph 80, you talk about, I suppose, the devolved element that this inquiry is investigating, and you say at 81 the inquiries are intertwined, and the remit, particularly of the Scottish inquiry. At 82, you make an interesting point, and again, I'd like you to read that out, please.
Yes. Before I do that, would you like a little bit of the historical background to it? Yes. After the swine flu pandemic, 2009, the governments of the 4 nations got together and they agreed they would go on a unified approach, and they produced a document in 2011 for a flu pandemic. I think the devolved nations had 2 paragraphs in it. And in 2012, there was another document produced for a communication strategy between the four nations. But overall, in the preparation, Scotland seems to have done a lot more preparation than the rest of the UK. And they've been in the process of doing their Let's Prepare Scotland leaflet system. And this has done a whole series of documents on different events that they have to prepare for and plan for. And as I mentioned to you earlier, one of the ways I coped with Jackie's death was looking at all of those plans and local authority plans and so on. But there is a series of them dating from 2016 through to 2018. John Swinney was the man responsible for that aspect of it all. But they were public documents for people to read and local authorities to look at and use to prepare their plans. But it covers all emergencies, so it does cover flooding, bad weather, and so on. And the structure in Scotland, it seems to be more simplified. And there's one document that showed the difference in the UK inquiry in Module 1, where they were showing the structures for the four nations. And if we say the UK-England one was actually called the spaghetti chart, including by the legals there as well.
I think I've seen that, yes.
Yes, it is so complex. The spaghetti chart is the best description you can give. So the Scottish one was much more simplified.
Thank you. You say at paragraph 88 that what you're telling the inquiry is second-hand, but you also obviously have first-hand experience.
Yes, yes.
And that should indicate that the inquiry is very interested in receiving information, particularly from people like yourselves, of what you term second-hand,
yes.
Anecdotal.
Yes, when I'm telling it, yes.
And we emphasise we are not a court. We're not hidebound by rules on the admissibility of evidence. Right. So we are very interested in hearing this. And again, you make the point at 89 that you represent, your group represents 200 families.
Yes.
At paragraph 92, you say that you do have a lot of stories, and at a high level, it would be more appropriate to focus on the issues arising further down the chain, which confronted our members' loved ones, ultimately leading to their deaths. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yes. For example, we know that every health board had infection control plans in place, which incidentally only ever say in them the reference to patients, only reference to patients and visitors as they can use alcohol hand gel. There's no other reference. But how did those plans come down through the organisations? Did they go the same plan to each hospital, or did hospitals tailor their own plans to sort out their own needs? And then how was that translated down to the frontline staff? Because I know many organisations that will write a document and say, yes, we've got one, and it's put on the shelf. So we need to know, was that properly communicated to all the people on the front line?
Right. Paragraphs 93 and 94, you get a bit political, put simply. Perhaps you just read that out, please.
Yes, it doesn't matter if the plans in place are the best in the world or not, if the political comprehension of the coming storm is lacking, and it's partly driven by pandering. And I do say, sorry, this was directed for the UK side, to the loudest MPs in government, irrespective of the science, rather than doing what's in the best interest of the people, then more people would die than would otherwise be the case. And many times during the pandemic, it appeared there was a culture of contempt for the ordinary people. And as I said before, hubris does not stop a pandemic. And I think this attitude has been confirmed by the investigation into the so-called Partygate scandal.
Thank you. I don't wish to cut out large sections of your statement, but I think a lot of what you go on to say are matters that you've already touched upon. So I'd like to skip on a little bit, if I may. Paragraph 111. If you could just read from there on a little bit down in that section, please.
Yes, this is in the context of lockdowns and the whole dealing with the pandemic. And we do know that it did have a tremendous negative effect on individuals, particularly in care homes, particularly those with dementia, who couldn't understand what was going on. And also, if you had dementia patients who are known as wanderers, the ones who need to wander, what could you do? You can't lock them in the room. And this issue with not allowing people to visit and so on, was it because of a lack of PPE? Could loved ones put PPE and come on in and, you know, at the same time you're getting care home workers saying, we're owned by a big group, with shortage of staff here. They're bringing people in from other areas of the country. So you've got people coming up from Birmingham, which was a COVID hotspot at that time, to work in a care home, yet you're not letting the nearest and dearest in. And you might have people who are doing a shift in one care home, then moving to a different care home to do another shift. So, as I think other groups have said, you know, if the loved one came in and had PPE to do that, it would be of tremendous benefit, not only to the individuals in the care home, but also to the organisation of the care home, with assistance they could give.
You continue on in your statement to look at a number of other countries and the approaches that were taken in other countries. And I can tell you, and indeed the wider inquiry, that this is an area that this inquiry will be looking at, and we will be obtaining comparative evidence so that it can inform our view. So this is something that we will look at, and we take it on board all that you say in that part of your statement. Just going towards the end of this part of the statement, could you go to paragraph 130, please? Because you're talking there about the concept of lockdown.
Yes.
We understand what that is. You've explained what that is. Can you just read on from 130 to the bottom of that section, please?
Yes. I think no one had considered the concept of lockdown, but I think it was too little, too late. And I mean that in the context of if something had been done earlier and if it could have been managed better, we wouldn't have perhaps had the long lockdowns that we did, but there was absolutely no plan for it. And so let's be honest, they were winging it. And personally, I didn't have a problem with lockdown. It didn't cause Jackie and I an issue. It kept her safe. But I know that some people did find it very difficult and very traumatic, particularly families whose older loved ones lived on their own, and the family used to pop in several times a day to look after them. And that's what enabled them to live on their own in their own home. And with all that being stopped, I think it was incredibly damaging. And I think if people had been treated more like adults and had it explained to them, this is what we've got to do to stop the virus, we need you to do this and do that, I think that would have helped. When masks were brought in, I don't think it was handled as well as it could be. I know, and I didn't have this bit in the statement, I know that from the UK lead on this, they were quite adamant that they didn't want masks because they didn't have mass stockpiles to deal with it. But, you know, it's said if you wear a mask, you stop other people getting COVID. And there's a lot of truth in that, but it all does depend on the mask. And if I may just expand on that slightly.
Yes, please do.
If you just make your own mask or just buy a mask in the shop that has no filtering material in it, then it is pretty ineffective. If you then go on and use the surgical type mask, that is designed to stop people, the germs coming out of someone's mouth and going to the person they're talking to, but naturally they don't fit very well on that. And then you're getting into the more important masks for dealing with an illness like COVID. I mean, you've got the main European standard is FFP2, and that prevents 94% of the particles coming into the lungs of the person who's wearing it. The American version of that is the N95 mask, which actually stops 95%. And then you've got the one which is really important, particularly for healthcare workers, people who are dealing up close and personal.
In a clinical setting, really.
Yes, and that stops 99.8% of particles coming in. There is but it was sort of wear a mask and that's it. Whereas in Portugal, for example, masks were called freedom masks. And they enforced the concept of everyone wearing a mask because it would free the country from COVID faster. So they turned it into a much more positive thing and brought people on board with it. I personally am a fairly risk-averse person, and I actually ordered masks in January 2020. I'm a reasonably, I think, not intelligent member of the population, probably more risk-averse than many, but I've seen the tweet from Devi Sherda, the chair of Global Public Health in Edinburgh University, on the 16th of January, where she said people were asking her, is this something we should be worried about? And she said, yes, we should be. So I thought I'd just play safe and do it, but that's me.
Right. I don't want to go through in any great detail your observations on the supply and distribution and use of PPE. I think we've got a flavour of what you're saying about that, and obviously we can read what's in your statement on that, and also the section on do not resuscitate, paragraphs 143 and following. I think perhaps it is perhaps important that you go to 151 in the statement. And I think you explain there where some of your information comes from, which is very helpful. Your father was a doctor, your mother was a nurse.
Yes.
And I think you explain that from that perspective you were able to understand the rationale behind the advice and discussion of do not resuscitate. Yes. And I think you go on at 152 and following to reiterate the point you made in the context of your personal statement this morning about the need to have information conveyed both directly and also in writing in intelligible and easily understood manner. You touch on, in this section, the next section of your statement on prolonged grief disorder, and I'm going to ask you to defer that until we look at your specific statement on that. And then you go on to the guidance that was handed out by the group. This is your group. I take it you're referred.
Which?
Sorry, at paragraph 160, guidance handed out by the group.
Oh, yes. That was the title of the question, but we didn't hand out official guidance. Right. But if people asked us for information or were trying to discuss it, then from my perspective, I'd say what I knew or send an email to them to explain what was happening. We did do updates, let people know where we were at and what was happening, but we didn't do guidance as such.
Okay.
We did say things, if you want someone's medical notes, find out what treatment they were given, you can request that from the hospital, contact this person, that sort of thing. Or if you feel your complaint isn't being dealt with properly, you can go to the Ombudsman. It was that sort of thing.
Yeah. Lessons to be learned. Again, this is something you've touched on in your own personal statement. Is there anything in particular from a wider group point of view that you would like to emphasise?
The one thing I would say prior to the views of the group, that the world was actually incredibly lucky, again for want of a better word, with COVID, that the case fatality rate was only around 1%. If it had been a flu pandemic, it would have been more in the region of 3 to 5%. Something like SARS, it'd be 10%. And if it was MERS, you'd be up at 30% fatality rate. So as scary and horrible and frightening as the death rate was, we were incredibly lucky, given the lack of preparation, that it wasn't significantly worse.
Also, in Lessons to be Learned at 168 of your statement, you talk about dealing with the aftermath and counselling. What do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, people in the group, from the feedback that they've given me, they have not found it that helpful. A lot of counselling groups are volunteer groups, and they are not able to deal with the complexities that arise from a death in a pandemic. And this is why we we encourage people to talk at the group. But I'm very aware that I'm not a counsellor and I'm not trained in it, so I worry that if I say something wrong, I could do more harm than good. So we do need to have some form of counselling service that can step in adequate numbers. And even if it ends up doing group counselling rather than one-to-one counselling, we have had people where they've gone for counselling and they've walked away because they felt the counsellor has not understood where they're coming from with grief and a pandemic.
I think a phrase I've heard you say, both in reading your statement, I think I've seen you on television on a number of occasions, you often say that people don't get it. Does that encapsulate some of the views that you're expressing?
Very much so, yes.
Okay, could we move on to funerals, because I know this is something you had to encounter after Jackie's death, and obviously a lot of your members had to encounter after the deaths of loved ones. So perhaps you could just take us through from 172 onwards.
Yes. Some of our members were told they were given a choice. You can either be with your loved one when they die or the funeral. You cannot do both. And that was incredibly difficult for those individuals who were put in that situation. And people make decisions in different ways. You know, some people, a funeral is a very, very important ritual. For other people, it's not so much. They want to be with the person as they pass away. But people did find the whole process so traumatic, starting off with many didn't realise that their loved one was double-bagged in a sealed body bag, which could not be opened, could not be unlocked. So they couldn't have viewings, they couldn't go and see them quietly in the funeral home afterwards, and they couldn't have their loved ones dressed appropriately. And those sorts of things were very difficult because you couldn't be with them at the end. You'd quite like to have gone and just sat quietly with them in the chapel of rest, whatever, and they couldn't do that. And then, of course, deciding how do you choose who goes to the funeral? You know, when it was only 6 people allowed to attend, you can't have singing because that produces aerosols and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I think was the most difficult was the lack of physical contact after bereavement or at a funeral. And if another family member was there and you didn't live together, they couldn't come up and give you a hug. And I think it was wrong to stop that. I mean, it's 7 months after Jackie died before I got a hug. And that's just not right, you know. It's so important, it's such a comforting thing, and not to do that. And of course, on the subject of people wearing masks at that time, at funerals, you can understand why they had to put restrictions on. And a lot of crematoriums and churches did act very quickly in putting video links in. But it is a very difficult situation to deal with. The only blessing we did have was, thank goodness, people were still able to have personal funerals, and the death rate wasn't at the size that it had to be mass burials. But some funeral directors were very good when they said, I'm sorry, we can't unseal the body bag, we can't undress your loved one in appropriate clothes, but then if you give us what you would have wanted them to wear or the favourite clothes or something, we'll put them in the coffin with them. And things like that, and they did that, and that was a comfort to people. But some places were almost cruel, and I can't remember who it was, but someone said that at their burial, they were not allowed to even leave the cars in the car park until the undertakers were ready with the coffin at the graveside. And then they were sort of told, come on, you can come over now. And then as soon as the coffin was in the ground, they were told, you've got to go now. You can't hang around over the grave. And we have to, as a society, we've got to find a better way. I can understand why you wouldn't have 200 people at a funeral like that. But as I said, we've got to find a better way.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you, Ms. Morrison. Paragraph 182 and following, you repeat your observation that as a group you want answers and we want to understand what went wrong, and why it went wrong, and we want to see better procedures and systems and more humanity in place for the next pandemic, because there will be one. And you say hopefully it won't be until after the inquiry and people have had a chance to learn lessons. So I hope that the people are going to be already learning lessons and put new things in place. So do I take it from that observation that you would want those who are taking decisions in the event that there is a future pandemic to be listening to what is being said at these inquiries?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. You also say that in 183, or just, would you read out 183, please?
Yes, I said I think we've got to think outside the box more, because I'm sure a lot of things can be improved dramatically just by thinking outside the box. And I think authorities have not to underestimate the people that they're dealing with.
Can you carry on, please?
Yes. I mean, as I said before, we've got a range of educated people to people who might have learning difficulties and that sort of thing. But if things are explained properly and we really understand what's going on and we see everybody else going through the same, it does make it much easier to comply. And the big thing we've got to do is get a grip on social media in a pandemic. And they've got to stop all these ridiculous conspiracy theories going on. And it's got to stop because, apart from the fact that some people do fall for some of these stories, it is so hurtful to those who have been bereaved to hear the naysayers saying it's a load of rubbish, it's not happening, it's just flu, and so on.
I think you conclude by saying freedom of speech is acceptable if it cannot be allowed to hurt other people.
Correct, yes.
And again, you've signed that statement, Ms. Morrison, and dated it. And again, this is your evidence to the inquiry on the organisational aspect.
Yes.
Lord, I wonder if we could again take 5-10 minutes just before the next statement, which will be shorter.
We could, 12:07, shall we say 12:20?
Thank you, Lord.
Right. Now, Mr. Gale, when you're ready.
Thank you, Lord. Ms. Morrison, thank you again for coming back. I'd like to move to the final statement that you've given. This is relatively brief, but there's a lot of important information in it that I'd like to discuss with you. It's entitled Grief and Bereavement During a Pandemic. And I think in the first paragraph you mention something that you think that needs to be looked at, and that's what's called prolonged grief disorder, and also known as traumatic bereavement. And you give some data from an American report said that levels may be as high as over 60%.
Correct.
You then were asked to look at a report prepared by Dr. Emily Harrop and her teams from Cardiff and Bristol universities. And this was published last month, and it's entitled Prolonged Grief During and Beyond the Pandemic, Factors Associated with Grief, Levels of Grief in a four-time point longitudinal survey of people bereaved in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think you've looked at that.
Yes.
And I think also you have indicated that there are certain points within that statement, that paper, that you haven't considered or indeed commented on, and in particular the socioeconomic status of some of the people who were surveyed for the purposes of that work. So you've made no comment on that. You say at paragraph 4 that there is one issue that you think needs stressing. And I wonder if you'd just read on from there, and then we'll come to look at various sections of the paper at a later stage.
Yeah. And the one issue that I thought needed to be stressed is the report says you have different levels of PGD depending upon all the factors they've looked at. And for our purposes as a group, we've never got into the realms of your grief is worse than their grief because of X, Y, and Z. And we've simply taken the approach that some members are really struggling to deal with their grief.
Yeah, and I think what you then set out, A to D, are various factors that the authors of the report identify.
Correct.
And you make comment of that when you come. So we can just take those as read. And if you'd carry on at paragraph 5, please.
Yes, so the 4 things we looked at is the relationship with the person who died. That is a significant factor. The cause, expectedness, and the place of death. These are the criteria within the report. The circumstances of the death and the disruption to grieving, coping, and the support process. So there's other considerations not fully examined, but obviously I can only speak as a layperson and base my view on talking to other members in Scottish COVID Bereaved. And I think during the pandemic, I think the trauma starts before the death of the loved one.
Yes. Please continue on, and I will come back to look at various aspects of the report as you come to the specific items and paragraphs 14 and following. But if you just carry on reading in what you're saying.
Yeah, for example, if someone's loved one was in a care home, I believe there was a little initial low level of constant fear. People were hearing all the dreadful stories in the press, initially from the horrendous things that are happening in Italy and Spain. So they're fearful that their loved ones would get COVID and die. Then when there was a decision to discharge all of those elderly, and to use the official words, bed blockers, from hospital untested into care homes, it soon became apparent that this was a problem in care homes, and some of those discharged were bringing COVID with them, which, as an added bit there, it occurred to me the other day, if they're bringing COVID with them, then it will be nosocomial COVID that they've got. But this, naturally, it ramps up the anxiety levels of the families, some care home workers mentioned before who did shifts in more than one care home, and some larger care home groups sent staff up from places like Birmingham, as I said before. So the families all see these things going on and they feel quite helpless, and they couldn't go in and see how their loved one was doing to check if they're all right because they were banned from visiting, and that in itself is also traumatic. And then if their loved ones caught COVID, the whole thing's ramped up tenfold, the helplessness and so on. And some care homes were being told, we don't take care home residents to hospital, order the end-of-life pack. We even had one group member who had a legal arrangement in place that she could take her mother out of care at any time. And when her mother caught COVID, and I believe was only getting end-of-life care, she wanted to take her mother home to nurse her. And she was threatened with action by social services. As it was, she did remove her mother from the home and nursed her in her final days. Imagine the trauma of coping with your worst fear realised. Your mother has COVID, dying, and on top of that, you're having to battle the system, cope with threats, and so on, when all she wanted to do was enable her mother's final days to be with the daughter who loves her and have time to properly care for her. So many more had the trauma of just, if they were lucky, looking through a window, trying to shout messages of love, knowing full well that nobody has helped put their loved one's hearing aids in so they can't be heard. You have the trauma of those who are sitting by the phone waiting for updates, if they were lucky, once a day from the hospital to find out how their loved one was doing. And I know from my own experience, on those days they're so long and your stress levels are going through the roof. You're praying, hoping for the best, at the same time you're fearing the worst. And the guilt and helplessness that you feel is unimaginable. The promises you've made to each other, you always look after each other and be there when times are tough. Here it was, the toughest of times, and breaking those promises through no fault of our own. So the point I'm trying to make is there's actually been a significant build-up of trauma before we even get to the actual death. As you know, some of us were fortunate enough to be there at the end, even when we were wearing gloves and masks. But even the final holding of hands is tainted because you're wearing gloves, you know, and you couldn't even kiss them goodbye. You were there trying your best to comfort them, and even then, you couldn't do it properly. And for those who could not be there, I think it was even worse. Again, this total helplessness, that the brain runs riot with all these questions. Do they know they're dying? Are they in pain? Are they gasping for breath? Are they completely alone, or is the nurse holding their hands? Do they know I'd be there if I could be? And so on. And if you're in lockdown and you're on your own, it's even worse. You don't even want to talk to anyone else on the telephone, just in case the hospital phones during that time. And again, if your loved one had a pre-existing health condition, you're living on tenterhooks for much of the time, worrying about them because of the risk they're at. And all these factors are traumatic, and I think they may be a significant contribution to the subsequent PGD.
I can just stop you there and ask that you be shown the paper by Dr. Harrop and her teams. The reference is SCIWT0730, and then 5 zeros and 2. And as I said, this paper was produced in September, so it is very, very recent. And I'll take some of the burden off you having to talk all the time, and if I can read out certain passages from this paper. The background in the abstract at the beginning begins, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a devastating and enduring mass bereavement event with uniquely difficult sets of circumstances experienced by people bereaved at this time. However, little is known about the long-term consequences of these experiences, including the prevalence of prolonged grief disorder, PGD, and other conditions in pandemic bereaved populations. And then there's details of the methods and the results. And going on to the next page, there is in the rubric, the conclusion, the results, these suggest higher than expected levels of PGD compared with pre-pandemic times, with important implications for bereavement policy, provision and practice now, for example, strengthening of social and specialist support, and in preparedness for future pandemics and mass bereavement events, for example, guidance on infection control measures and rapid support responses. And again, taking matters very briefly, there's a lengthy but very informed background section, which those who wish can read. And then if one goes on within the document to the section, in a moment. If we go on to the section 4.1, it's at page 20 within the document itself. There is a section entitled Grief Levels and the Effects of Time. And I think, again, this is something that you have looked at and you make some comments on. And I think we see from the report that the writers say, we found relatively high levels of indicated PGD and grief vulnerability overall and across time. As in other studies, time since death was negatively associated with overall levels of PGD symptoms and to a lesser extent levels of grief vulnerability, with a pattern of improvement and normal grief trajectories for many. However, there are also patterns of worsening grief and grief which remained relatively static over time. There then goes, the writers then go on to consider the person who died, and I think this is the obvious one, the relationship with that person, and I don't think I need to go through that in any detail. I think we can understand that. They then go on to consider in 4.3 the cause, expectedness, and place of death. And obviously, again, that's something that is of significance, and probably related to that at 4.4, the circumstances of death. And then the other element of this report that you gave consideration to was the disruption to grieving, coping, and support processes. Yes. Now, if I can take you also to the discussion, I'm sorry, not the discussion section, the conclusion section at section 5. And this is probably worthy of lengthy read-through, and I will do that. The authors say we found relatively high levels of indicated PGD at circa 8, 13, and 23 months post-bereavement when compared with similar non-pandemic studies of bereaved populations. And skipping on, if I may, to the paragraph towards the end of that right-hand column. So based on these findings, we make the following recommendations to inform bereavement support and policy at the present time and in future pandemics, many of which resonate with the recent reports of the UK Commission on Bereavement. And number one, in view of the higher proportion of people experiencing or at the risk of PGD following the pandemic, bereavement support services require increased investment to ensure adequate levels of specialist provision which can effectively cater for those with more complex needs, as well as robust methods of identifying and reaching people most in need of more intensive support. Bereaved people more likely to require such support include those grieving children, partners, and siblings, and following unexpected deaths, as well as people who are isolated and have limited social support, health conditions, and low levels of formal education. Secondly, opportunities for informed emotional and social support should be strengthened through provision of peer support groups, as well as compassionate community initiatives and educational programs which seek to improve grief literacy and the support available to people within existing social and community networks. Communities worst affected by COVID-19 and structural inequalities should be prioritised in such initiatives. And then policies and training should be implemented to ensure compassionate and supportive communication and behaviours from healthcare professionals at the end of life, especially in acute and care home settings. Follow-up contact should be consistently delivered by care providers following the death and enable meaningful discussion and reflection on difficult and troubling experiences with signposting to locally and nationally available bereavement support services. I would stop there, if I may, Ms. Morrison. Can we go back to your statement, having looked at those various passages? And if we could go back to paragraph 14, where you deal with the first of the significant factors, as it was put. And if we would just read from there, please.
Yes, the first one is the relationship to the person who died. And to me, this seems obvious. The closer you were to the deceased, the more grief you will have to deal with. But within that, I think, again, the level of, for want of a better expression, the responsibility the bereaved had for that individual is a big factor. For example, if as a parent you've lost your child, even if they're grown up and have their own life, in addition to the natural shock and trauma, there's also an element of guilt that they should have been there to protect the child. And I think it's also true when your partner is lost to COVID. I mean, I can only reflect on my personal situation, but I know every time and day in relation to Jackie's death. Yet my mother died not from COVID, but the following year. I couldn't even tell you the date she died or when her funeral was. I mean, I went to it, but I couldn't tell you the date. There's just no room in my psyche to take any more information like that on board.
Yeah. Then the cause and unexpectedness and place of death.
Yeah, although the reports looked at this as a separate topic, I think it links in very much with the next point, point 3. Yes. And I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on whether dying in one location, e.g. a care home, is better or worse than dying in a hospital. Yeah.
And circumstances of death, which is obviously the connect with what you've just said.
Yeah. The report says, for example, that hospital deaths from COVID were the most traumatic. To me, there is a certain logic to that because the individual has obviously become so ill that unless it was nosocomial COVID and they were already in hospital, they were being rushed to hospital for treatment. So you imagine a scenario where you've seen your loved one decline rapidly in health, you've been worried about them, looking after them, and then you think, no, bad, I've got to phone for the ambulance. And they decide hospital admission is the correct course of action. So you're dashing around, putting things together with them to take to hospital, trying to think of everything, because you won't be able to take anything in if you forget later on. The ambulance crew of your loved one in the ambulance by now, you hand over the bag, a quick masked kiss, and off they go. And then suddenly you're left standing there, and it hits you that you've just probably seen them for the last time. You know, so you're thinking that, did you remember to tell them you loved them? Did you remember to their phone charger? You know, all these things are whirling round in your head, and you can't ask your best friend to come over to support you. You're literally on your own. And I've already described what it's like waiting to know what's happening. But when we consider the death itself in relation to PGD, this can be summed up as poor end-of-life care, whether actual or perceived, with poor communication and support immediately after death. And I particularly welcome that recommendation at point 3 in the report about improved communication and training. I mean, Many of our members have concern about the death of their loved one, and I believe much of it is down to poor communication during the time leading up to death, as I've previously outlined. They're left feeling that their loved one was not being properly looked after or cared for, and I use the word cared quite deliberately, as some people were getting little or poor communication, felt that this was because the medical staff didn't care. And as I was particularly pleased, the report recognised that communication has to be better. Of particular concerns was the withdrawal of fluids and nutrition from elderly patients and the issue of DNRs, as we've previously discussed. But it was particularly so, I think, for those who couldn't be with their loved one at this time, because they're haunted with what happened to their loved ones, where they just left to die on their own. They didn't know if the death was peaceful or traumatic. And when you're not there, your imagination runs riot. I know that many hospitals and care homes try to have someone with the person at this time. But even then, it's not a family member. It's not someone who knew and loved them. And again, many people feel guilt because of this. It's just a natural reaction. I wasn't there for them.
The final part of Dr. Harrop's report work is entitled, so far as you're commenting on, is Disruption to Grieving, Coping and Support Processes, which obviously include funerals.
Yes.
And again, I'd be grateful if you just read what you say there, please, from paragraph 21 onwards.
I mean, sadly for some people, this impact came on immediately. We have one member who lost her father. She was with them at the end, but immediately after he died, she was taken into a side room where she was sprayed down by a nurse. She doesn't know what it was, assumes it was some type of disinfectant, and she was told to go home, and she was unable to go and tell her mother, who was in the same hospital that her husband had died, and her mother died a few days after this. We have other members who were able to be with their loved one at the end, but not offered a chance to sit with them for a while after they died, and they felt they were being rushed out of the hospital. And depending on the timing of the death and the relevant restrictions, with people going back on their own to an empty house and unable to have even their own adult children around to come over and support them and help organise the funeral. I've already mentioned, not being able to view and dress the deceased, and the issues of socially distanced funerals have been well reported and desperately difficult to choose who can attend. And a funeral, as we know, is normally a time to celebrate the life of a person, to bring people together from all areas of a person's life and hear all the stories about them, to share the happy stories as well as the sad, and to reaffirm that that individual made a difference in people's life, and to have that human contact with hugs as well as tears. And so many families were denied this opportunity. There was also the difficulty in trying to sort out someone's belongings or indeed clear their house during a pandemic. Charities would not accept clothing. House clearance firms were significantly reduced, and only a few firms would take it on because of all the additional steps required, such as PPE and so on. There was also the difficulty in next of kin if they stayed in a different area or even abroad, dependent upon the restrictions at the time. But even when the restrictions were eased, there's still moments that appeared to add insult to injury. We have a member who lives outside Scotland who came back home when her parents were ill. Her father died in hospital of COVID, with her mother dying a week later, and another family member was in intensive care at the time. So she had to stay at her parents' home while she organised and paid for the funerals, cleared the house out and sort out all the other admin that comes along with bereavement. But in addition to dealing with all that, she received a bill of £500 from the council for staying in the property after her parents' deaths. Many people didn't even get a call from the GP's practice just to see how they were doing. And the expression cast adrift comes to mind. And however, even with all that trauma going on, there was the massive impact of being bereaved simply from the point of view that everywhere we went, every time we switched on the news, picked up a paper, COVID was in the headlines, actually, day after day, week after week. Then as time went by and the conspiracy theorists seemed to gain more ground and the COVID deniers were becoming more vocal, it was incredibly distressing. But I think the ultimate insult came when all of the so-called Partygate stories came out and people became so angry and felt they'd been punished for following the rules. They felt they'd been treated with absolute contempt, and they felt they'd been taken for a ride and treated as mugs. And that produced so much anger, it's difficult to find the words to adequately display it. But all of those factors contribute, in my view.
And again, Ms. Morrison, you've signed that statement dated it, and again, that constitutes your evidence to the inquiry. Yes. Ms. Morrison, that is all that I need to ask you about. Can I thank you on behalf of the council team and the inquiry team widely for the obvious care that you put into putting together your statements, and we are very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ms. Morrison. Good. Ms. Gale, it's 1:45. Is it possible to start at 1:45, or arrangements?
Yes, my lord. I think the witnesses certainly will be here.
I suspected that they will be here.
Yes.
If by any chance it's impossible, that doesn't matter.
I'll let you know.
Could I ask everyone to be here for 1:45? Very good. Thank you.